This video is the first in a 7-part retrospective looking back on Sherlock and TJLC 5 years later. Based on the runtime of this video alone, you probably understand why I decided to split it up. This isn't even the longest one. It turns out trying to wrap all this up neatly after all this time is going to take a little while. I hope the end result is worth the wait. So grab a snack and the warm drink of your choice. We have a lot of ground to cover today. Hello friends, my name is Rebecca, or Rebs for short, and I'm here today to discuss the legacy of BBC Sherlock in my life, and I suspect in a lot of yours as well. This video is mainly targeted at the old audience of this channel and is part of my two-pronged attempt to provide closure for myself and for all of you. In case you haven't seen some of my other recent videos, the other strategy was focused on the story itself, taking the first 10 episodes and extrapolating from there what Series 4 of Sherlock might have looked like if TJLC Explained had been more or less correct. You can find a link to that story, From a Drop of Water, in the description. If you're new to the channel, you are welcome to stay, but I suspect that a lot of this retrospective won't make much sense to you. The retrospective is also more geared towards people who left the fandom after 2017 than to current TJLC members. To my TJLC homies, I do hope you'll stick around and watch. I think you'll still enjoy the retrospective, but a lot of this is going to be walking through the mental and emotional journey of revisiting this story after years of shutting it away. I think that will be a familiar story to a lot of you, but perhaps not the one you still need. So I ask your patience. But also bear in mind that I am not making this to bring anyone back to TJLC. At the end of the day, I'm here to try to provide closure. On the flip side of that, for people who have spent years harboring anger and resentment towards the show and its writers, I will warn you, this video is going to be deliberately very generous towards them, and is more open to ongoing theorizing about the show than I think some of you who left the show behind will be expecting. In full disclosure, the final video in this retrospective will be episode 49 of TJLC Explained. And I know some of you instantly froze up as I said that. I know that feeling, that mix of panic and anger. I understand where it's coming from, and I'm asking you to trust me. I am doing things differently this time. Even in that video, I'm not going to try to convince you that TJLC is the right reading. But I think having a conversation about why some people still think there's more to the story is going to be a necessary step in fully finding closure for a lot of you. It was for me. But I do also understand if you don't want to watch that video. Don't worry, I have 2 different preemptive endings at points where I think people will want to duck out. I'm aware that because of my both sides stance on things here, this retrospective might not be the one that anyone wanted. I've decided that I'm okay with that. One of the things I regret most from my time with the show was the way I was so convinced I knew what was right that I developed a bad case of tunnel vision. So I'm going into this now, deliberately keeping myself unsure and open to different ideas and perspectives. I can't go back in time and fix my mistakes, but I can hopefully learn from those experiences and do things differently now. And the thing is, even in light of that uncertainty, my thoughts and feelings on Sherlock now are a lot more positive than I ever thought they could be again. And I hope the perspective that I've gained in the last few months of revisiting the show can be helpful to some of you as well. Maybe it's the writer in me, but I think a lot of the course of our lives is determined by stories. Not just the ones we consume, but the ones we tell ourselves. I think a lot of us took what happened with this show and our time with it and told ourselves a story based on it. A story built on anger and pain and hopelessness. And maybe some of the pieces of that story were true, but I also don't think that was the whole story. I don't have all the answers. I don't even have most of them. But here's what I do know. I spent almost 5 years of my life refusing to even think about this show, this story, because I felt so deeply wounded over what had happened. Felt so much pain over the way I viewed myself and my actions because of it. And in my bitterness and fear, I didn't want to give the people who had made the show another instant of my time. That felt like the only way to get back some small amount of control. What I didn't realize was that in doing that, I was only robbing time from myself. There are 5 years of my life that I spent paralyzed by shame and regret that I can never get back. When I eventually reluctantly came back to this story, I realized pretty quickly that it was still shaping who I was. Not that this show is all that I am as a person, it's not, but in the same way, I don't know who I would be if I hadn't grown up on the Matrix movies and playing The Legend of Zelda, who I would be if I hadn't chosen to read The Picture of Dorian Gray as my free choice novel my senior year of high school. I don't know who I would be today if I hadn't watched Sherlock and been a part of TJLC. But because I was refusing to acknowledge that, the effect those things were having on me was a miserable one. I was shutting away entire pieces of myself because they reminded me of something I couldn't bear to remember. And I eventually realized that I had a choice. I could keep doing that, living a half-life out of fear and sorrow and shame, or I could come back, look at what had happened for as long as it took to come to terms with it, and tell myself a better story. I finally chose the latter. And if that's a choice you'd like to make, this video is for you. What happened here was messy and ugly and complicated. I'm not going to pretend that it wasn't. But that's not all it was. There is hope and joy and beauty to be found from this experience, if you're willing to look for it. I'd like to help you start. Like an unfolding love story, though, revisiting this requires some delicacy. I'm going to walk you through this journey one step at a time. Softly, slowly, gently, and kindly. Let's start with the very basics to ease us all in. BBC Sherlock, co-created by lead writers Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat, is a modern reimagining of the Sherlock Holmes stories written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. At time of recording, the show consists of 4 3-episode series and 1 Victorian Christmas special for a grand total of 13 episodes airing between 2010 and 2017. The show was a massive hit, particularly for its first 2 series, and garnered international attention. As was the case for most fan communities in the early 2010s, and indeed most fan communities throughout time, one of the main draws for many fans were the relationships between various characters. And of all the relationships on the show, there was none quite so popular as the dynamic between the show's 2 leads, Sherlock Holmes and John Watson. And that makes a lot of sense. Not only are they the 2 main characters, so you'd expect there would be more attention on them, there has been a queer reading of the relationship between Holmes and Watson for about as long as the characters have been around. And the show only leaned into that history, with constant references to the 2 characters maybe having romantic feelings for each other. The thing to keep in mind, though, is that 2010 to 2013 was a different time. Even the most invested shippers didn't actually expect it to ever happen on the show, because it just never did. That was the case for BBC Sherlock too. While a lot of people were invested in the show because of the relationship between Sherlock and John, no one really expected it to go anywhere until 2014. I think the context is important to have here. In the lead up to the 3rd series of Sherlock, it was well known that the show was going to introduce the character of Mary Morstan, John Watson's wife in the stories, or his first wife. We're not getting into that today. He never had a wife. And that John would get married to her in the 2nd episode of series 3. The perception at the time was that this was being done to dismiss any lingering doubt on whether or not a relationship between Sherlock and John was possible. There was an expectation going in that the wedding episode would unambiguously state once and for all that Sherlock Holmes and John Watson had only ever been friends. When The Sign of 3 aired, that definitively was not what happened. The show not only skips over the wedding and several other opportunities to show the audience romantic moments between John and Mary, the entire episode is centered around Sherlock's love for John. Unambiguously. And rather than toning down the queer subtext, the episode dialed it up to 11, going so far as to end the episode with a long, melancholy shot of Sherlock leaving John's wedding early, alone and miserable. Because of this gulf between the episode people expected and the one we got, for the first time, people began to wonder, what if what had been dismissed as a gay joke wasn't a joke at all? What if Sherlock was reading like a love story because it was one? What if a mainstream show, and not just that, a mainstream Holmes adaptation, was finally going to go there? But the writers had said before that they weren't going to do it, unless they were trying to keep the biggest twist in their story a secret. And so TJLC, or the John Locke Conspiracy, was born. I feel like I should pause to clarify because there has been a lot of confusion about this over the years. TJLC was a literary theory first and foremost, not an actual conspiracy. The only conspiracy element was the belief that the writers were lying so as not to spoil the plot of their own show, which is a far cry from being an anti-vaxxer or believing the earth is flat. Real writers do that kind of thing all the time. Just look at some of the stuff Marvel Studios has done to prevent details of their upcoming plots from getting leaked. Denying an upcoming plot twist is par for the course. TJLC only continued to gain steam when His Last Vow aired, and included such delights as Sherlock relapsing as soon as John gets married, John being insanely jealous of Sherlock's new fake girlfriend, John's seemingly wonderful wife turning out to be an assassin who tries to kill Sherlock when he offers to help her, Sherlock literally restarting his heart to keep John safe from his wife, and a final heartbreaking scene that was straight out of Casablanca. Aborted declarations of love and all. Over the next few years, the TJLC theory and community developed. The more people looked, the more evidence there seemed to be. It wasn't just a few jokes, it went a lot deeper than that. People only got more confident when the TJLC reading more or less entirely predicted the plot of The Abominable Bride before it aired. In the build-up to Series 4, there was this sense of certainty that this was going to be it. The creators were doing everything they could to hype up the series, attending panels and interviews where they called it television history and insane wish fulfillment. This is the period of time in which I made the majority of the videos on this channel. I felt confident enough that the TJLC reading of the show was the correct one, that I wanted to create a record of the community's theories before the big reveal, so later people could look back and know that we had gotten it right. We had been told, and we had listened. And then Series 4 came out, and it was, to put it mildly, particularly that much anticipated finale, The Final Problem. What the writers had said was everything they ever wanted to do with the show turned out to not quite be what anyone was expecting, and the fallout was spectacular. On a personal level, I'll say it wasn't the happiest of times in my life. Some of it was disappointment. Losing the story I loved, losing what I had thought that story would represent. Some of that was because I had placed so much certainty on being right about this, I suddenly felt unqualified to assess what was real and what wasn't, just generally speaking. How many other things did I believe that were likewise just pleasant lies I was telling myself? How much could I trust myself to know anything? That feeling lasted for a long time. The majority of it, though, was the crushing guilt that settled in about halfway into watching The Final Problem as it aired. The certainty that I had just inadvertently caused hundreds, if not thousands of others to experience the same pain I currently was. That in the end, every person that had called me crazy, and a cult leader, and a monster, was right. That feeling lasted for a long time, too. I desperately wanted to try to do something to try to make things right, but I didn't know what I could do. Eventually, I stopped trying. I just ran instead, shoved all of this into a box and didn't open it. The story I told myself was that it was a good thing that this had happened to me while I was still relatively young, so that I would know, for the rest of my life, that I could not be trusted to write or create or do anything with any kind of an audience, because this channel had felt like the right thing to do at the time. Something that was creating joy and hope, that was helping people connect with literary analysis and their fellow fans and queer identity. But it had only ended in pain. How could I know that the next time it wouldn't end the same way? So I just decided I wouldn't take that chance again. While that was an extreme case, from talking to others, I know I wasn't entirely alone in that. A lot of people shut away their time with Sherlock and just accepted the fact that it was going to be a source of grief forever. I suppose that's one of those things that's impossible to understand from the outside. How could a TV show be that devastating? I think people who say we were overinvested do have a point, but there was this idea, this story about the story. I've already said that I believe stories do have a genuine impact on who we turn out to be as people. I think that's especially true when you're an isolated, lonely, queer person feeling like the world is hostile towards you for who you are, and you're looking for any sign that there might be people out there who think people like you matter, that your story matters. For people like that, finding representation can have a tremendous impact, and it can even impact people who aren't queer themselves. When Ellen came out in 1997 and she was on the cover of Time magazine under the headline, "Yep, I'm gay," that made a difference to the way general audiences saw queer people, even if it was only a small start. The same can be said for popular animated shows like The Legend of Korra and Steven Universe and She-Ra. There's a reason that people want Elsa to have a girlfriend, because kids growing up in a world where that would be okay, and as cynical as it is, a world where that is marketable, would mark a huge shift. Going back to Sherlock, there was an additional layer of significance to telling a queer romance with these characters, Sherlock Holmes and John Watson. The way a lot of us saw it, these characters, some of the most well-known in the world, had existed for over a century and had their story told over and over and over again, but never the true story, because it couldn't be. But now, in this show, that story was finally going to be told by people who were delighted to be the ones to finally tell it, that this was going to mark a shift in the way people regarded queer stories, that there would be a before Sherlock and there would be an after Sherlock. And after Sherlock, anything would be possible. And suddenly that was gone. Of course, disappointment wasn't the only reaction. You probably already know that. People were either immediately devastated or came up with theories to hold on to hope a little longer. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about what happened in the immediate aftermath of Series 4, but I don't begrudge those people trying to hold on to that story a little longer, that this could be the moment where everything changed. I just hope that it's an experience to learn from. And I think people have learned from their experience with BBC Sherlock. That's not really the danger from what I have observed. The danger now is the overcorrection. I think I can safely say that I overcorrected in the extreme. Do I wish I had done things differently? Yes, absolutely. Was punishing myself by not letting myself do any of the things I loved because I felt unworthy really fixing anything? No. And it was actively keeping me from moving on because I wouldn't let myself look at this for long enough to move on. It wasn't just that. I convinced myself the show must have been awful all along, that I had been silly and foolish to like it, and that certainly there had never been any justified reason to think a romance between Sherlock and John would actually go anywhere. I had been crazy to think otherwise. After finally finding the courage to face the show again, I'll tell you, I don't think that's true. TJLC, correct or not, was and is a much more reasonable frame of analysis than people give it credit for. So that's what I'd like to talk about next. Justifying TJLC. Explaining it, if you will. I'm making this retrospective under the assumption that the majority of the people watching were at some point in, or at least receptive to, TJLC. So like the recap of what Sherlock is, this summary might be unnecessary. But then again, 5 years have passed since then, and from personal experience, I know the way TJLC was perceived by others did slowly alter the way I perceived it myself. I just told you that I spent the better part of 5 years believing that my time in TJLC was me suffering some sort of extended mental break. And I knew more of the evidence in favor than most. First though, I want to address how the worst actions of some of the people in TJLC often get used as proof that the theory itself was bunk. Let's jump back to 2014. Before it even had a name, TJLC was dismissed as complete nonsense by the vast majority of people. The prominent TJLC meta-writers in those early days, people like Natty, Loudest Subtext in Television, were instantly on the receiving end of a dog pile, purely for having the audacity to believe that a mainstream show might make a queer relationship canon. This was happening before His Last Vow even came out, and to people who, before The Sign of Three, were relatively unknown in fandom. I think that's important context to have. The vitriol directed at TJLC was immediate and intense. I think you'll often hear that TJLC was a community prone to drama, both with other groups in the larger Sherlock fandom and with infighting. And that was true. Tempers ran high frequently. But I think a lot of it came from that initial reaction. It had everyone in the community on the alert, knowing that to everyone else, we were a bunch of insane weirdos trying to ruin the show by making it gay. That came first. That led to a lot of defensiveness and this shared sense of sarcastic humor that sparked arguments just as often as it led to camaraderie. It led to people digging in their heels on their specific reading because it felt like you had to fight to hold on to it. And it was sort of a vicious cycle. People theorizing about TJLC were treated badly, so they were rude and dismissive towards others, which only made people more irritated at the community, and on and on and on. Now, having said that, this is meant more as an explanation for how things were rather than a justification. On a personal level, I regret a lot of my own behavior at the time. I made a conscious effort on this channel to steer clear of the drama, but I didn't always succeed, and I definitely didn't always succeed on Tumblr. I had trained myself to expect vitriol, and while I did get it, I knew even at the time that while I had a large volume of it, because this channel ended up as one of the biggest platforms in the community, the ratio of nonsense I got was far better than most. I suspect that's because my content was always associated with a face and a name, so people were always a bit more aware that I was a person. The awareness that I had it relatively good didn't stop me from responding to criticism in impatient and unkind ways, including criticism that I look back on now and see as being fair and kindly worded points from people just trying to spare me pain. I regret that. I don't think I handled having a platform well at the time, and I had less of an excuse for my behavior than most others did. And it's not just how I reacted to criticism. I had some uninformed opinions, and opinions on things that looking back I regret ever having an opinion on. I said and did a lot of things I wish I hadn't. If my actions hurt you, I'm sorry. and I know that doesn't undo it. All I can do is try to learn from that experience and do better going forward. I like to think I've handled things better this time, but I also know it's been easier this time. My audience is a lot smaller now. I hope the regret that I still feel over what I've done will serve as a reminder to try to do better from now on. But that's kind of my point. Fandom behavior stuff, that's going to be a case-by-case basis. I can really only address my own, just as you can really only address your own. And most of the audience of this video, and indeed most of the people who were a part of TJLC, were not big-name fans, problematic or otherwise. In fact, for a lot of people, the TJLC community was a largely positive experience. Again, it was a chance for lonely queer people to meet other lonely queer people, and you got to talk about a shared interest that most people felt like you couldn't talk about to the people in real life. That was my primary experience of the TJLC community too. A group of bright, clever, caring people who were passionate about the same things I was. And those friendships were real. Some of us stayed close even when none of us liked the show anymore. Others I have been happy to reconnect with now that I'm spending some time back in the fandom. So I wanted to address the areas where I think TJLC as a community went wrong, mostly so I could apologize for my own behavior. But this series is focused on TJLC the reading, not TJLC the community. Even if every negative thing said about TJLC was the entire truth and there were no redeeming qualities, I don't think the vibe of the community can be used as an argument against the reading. They are separate things. Of course, the reading itself got its fair share of criticism. What I'd like to argue here is that many of the critiques that were directed at TJLC as a reading were not things unique to TJLC. The most common that I've seen are that TJLC was wrong to analyze or overanalyze a popular piece of media, that TJLC was wrong to try to use analysis to predict where the story might go, and that the techniques used by TJLC were inherently silly. Looking back on it, I don't think any of these are particularly valid criticisms. Let's take the overanalysis critique first. I've already brought up my love for the Matrix movies, so I'll keep using them as an example. If you're my age or older, you probably remember the way the films were analyzed to death at the time they came out. And by and large, that was seen as a good thing, that a popular action movie had gotten people to ask these deep questions about philosophy and choice and identity. Of course, there was one particular theory that was almost universally dismissed at the time as a fringe reading with no basis. The reading that the entire story was a metaphor for the experience of being transgender. No one thought that could possibly be right. Not in 1999. But in 2021, Lana Wachowski did confirm that she and her sister based their first film on their experiences as trans women. So the insane queer theories can be right some of the time. Let's move on to address the idea that you can't use analysis to predict where a story will go. You absolutely can, and it's something fans have always done. Pick a currently updating story, and I can probably find you countless theories of where it will go next. And a lot of those fans will be just as sure of themselves as the members of TJLC were. Again, that's usually considered normal fan behavior. Unless, of course, you're trying to predict that a story will end in queer romance. To this day, those readings are still not taken to particularly well, or the techniques themselves. It has been said that when you boil down the TJLC reading, it consists of only the silliest things. At the end of the day, we're all just sat around shouting things at each other like, tea is gay, food is sex, phones are hearts. And I'll concede that all of that does sound rather silly. Absolutely fair. I'd like to make a very gentle counter-argument. It's not just TJLC symbols. The lion is Jesus. The raven is death. The conch shell is society. The red hat is his dead brother. The billboard is God. The green light is our unattainable dreams. The tree is Francie. That all sounds silly too because you've stripped the symbols of all context. And that doesn't work because literary analysis is all about the context. TJLC symbols are not unique in that way. So I am sort of arguing here that the differentiating factor between the way TJLC is viewed and the way other media criticism is viewed is that it's based on a queer reading. Now again, I do think the situation is a bit more nuanced than that. The dismissal of the theory led to the defensive environment, that led to people getting annoyed at that behavior, that led to people digging in their heels, etc., etc., etc. I think you can also absolutely argue that the extent to which people were attached to this, because it was viewed as this possibility of genuine validation by a lot of lonely queer fans, led to some negative extremes. There were other reasons that people were annoyed at TJLC. But again, I think it all started with that outright dismissal that TJLC couldn't be right because we were taking the idea of a queer romance seriously, that we were expecting subtext to actually lead somewhere. I don't think that every person that has criticized or dismissed TJLC is consciously doing it because they think expecting a story to portray a queer romance is inherently wrong or cringeworthy. And I acknowledge that a lot of the criticisms have absolutely nothing to do with that. But I do think that this underlying discomfort with queer fans expecting subtext to pay off has done a lot to frame the discussion of TJLC for as long as it has been around. Again, looking at the theory itself, if you take the time to actually look at what was being said and don't just dismiss the analysis because it's being done to support a queer reading, I think it's a lot more reasonable than people give it credit for. So here I'm going to reintroduce you to the techniques used in the TJLC reading, trying to argue that none of the specific techniques being used here are outlandish or even that novel. This bit of the discussion will be leaving aside the question of authorial intent for the moment. We will come back to that. For now, we're going death of the author. We don't care what the writers meant. We just want to know if the reading checks out. And we may as well start with the big three: food, drinks, and phones. Honestly, this particular bit of symbolism is so Literature 101 that the book I had to read in AP English in high school, How to Read Literature Like a Professor, had not one but two separate chapters on it. Sometimes a meal is just a meal, and eating with others is simply eating with others. More often than not, though, it's not. Once or twice a semester at least, I will stop discussion of the story or play under consideration to intone, whenever people eat or drink together, it's communion. For some reasons, this is often met with a slightly scandalized look, communion having for many readers one and only one meaning. While that meaning is very important, it is not the only one. So I have to explain that just as intercourse has meanings other than sexual, or at least did at one time, so not all communions are holy. In fact, literary versions of communion can interpret the word in quite a variety of ways. The general idea is that meal sharing is something that we as human beings do to draw closer to one another. So writing characters sharing meals, or failing to share meals, or getting sick in the middle of a meal can all be used to tell you something about the state of the relationship between those characters. That's how I read it most of the time when characters were eating or not eating on Sherlock. It was shorthand for intimacy or a lack of it. But it sometimes went a step further than that. Food as a representation of sexual intimacy. Let's start with Dracula himself. You know how in all those Dracula movies, or almost all, the Count always has this weird attractiveness to him? Sometimes he's downright sexy. Always he's alluring, dangerous, mysterious. And he tends to focus on beautiful, unmarried, which in the social vision of 19th century England meant virginal, women. I think we'd be reasonable to conclude that the whole Count Dracula saga has an agenda to it beyond merely scaring us out of our wits. In fact, we might conclude it has something to do with sex. Again, this is not unique to TJLC. I'm sure you can think of some sensual meal scenes in film. I'll help you out with one.
It starts so simply. Each line of the program creating a new effect, just like poetry. We are completely out of control.
Again, not a unique read by any stretch of the imagination. But why did people think food might sometimes represent sexual intimacy on BBC Sherlock specifically? Was there a reason? Yes. As with most literary symbolism, the audience is usually relying on a blatant tip-off, either through dialogue or narration. You can make the argument that anything is symbolic, and it might be, but it does help considerably to have some clue to go off of, a hint that this is a connection you're meant to see. And the potential connection between food and sex is made explicitly in A Scandal in Belgravia.
You look sexy on Crime Watch. Let's have dinner. I'm not hungry. Let's have dinner. Have you ever had anyone? And when I say had, I'm being indelicate.
I don't understand.
I'll be delicate then. Let's have dinner.
Why?
You might be hungry.
I'm not.
Good.
Why would I want to have dinner if I wasn't hungry?
So the connection is validated in dialogue. Now you might say that's only in this episode, or only in the context of Sherlock and Irene, but there was reason to believe that this connection had been in the writers' minds all along.
You haven't eaten today. For God's sake, you need to eat.
No, you need to eat. I need to think. The brain's what counts. Everything else is transport.
Do you have a girlfriend who feeds you up sometimes?
That's what girlfriends do. Feed you up.
You don't do anything.
Everything else is transport.
So in light of that, what might we make, for example, of the countless scenes that Sherlock spends watching John eat while he himself abstains? After all, why would he want to go to dinner with someone if he wasn't hungry?
You may as well eat. We might have a long wait.
Thanks. Thank you.
Feeling better?
surprised we've hardly stopped for breath since this thing started. Thanks, Ben.
Or the fact that by the time of the events of The Hounds of Baskerville, Sherlock and John are so in sync with one another that they're eating and drinking all the same things.
We have eaten and drunk exactly the same thing since we got to Grimple, apart from one thing. You don't take sugar in your coffee.
Or that in the lead up to his wedding, John is listening to Mrs. Hudson compare her marriage to his and becomes so nauseated that he can't bear to eat, specifically after spending the evening prior with Sherlock.
I don't mind.
Yeah, I'm there if you want.
Well, marriage changes everything, John.
Is it?
Yeah. You might not think it, but it does. It's a different phase in your life.
It's a hangover in more ways than one. I have similar thoughts about him complaining about all the cake he's had to try for the wedding.
I've sampled 9 different slices of cake, which all tasted identical. I'm faking opinions, and it's exhausting.
Or how about the fact that in Sherlock's mind, John and Mary never share meals?
Where did she go? She's always out these days.
Not unlike yourself.
Or a very sad Sherlock, thinking John doesn't want anything else to do with him, eating chips alone in the dark.
So I think someone's got John. John Watson?
That last one is even worse with a line that comes later.
Chips.
Chips.
You're suicidal. You're allowed chips. Trust me. It's about the only perk.
Again, leaving aside the discussion of authorial intent for the time being, I think this is a fairly standard, reasonable bit of symbolic analysis. Not particularly remarkable, apart from the fact that it was being used to justify a queer reading. This one is related to the idea of food being symbolic of intimacy, but is a bit more nuanced. The general idea here is that what a character chooses to drink tells you about their state of mind at that moment. You just have to work out the code. Having now written a story with drink code, I can honestly say that it's pretty easy to use from a writing standpoint. Let's start with the one most explicitly confirmed in dialogue. On Sherlock, the characters drink hard alcohol when they're afraid. This is confirmed more than once.
Look at me. I'm afraid, John. Afraid.
He didn't want a drink, he needed one. He's not embarrassed. He's afraid.
So if we wanted to, we could apply that understanding to the other scenes where a character is drinking hard liquor and assume that they are likewise afraid for one reason or another.
So she's alive then. How are we feeling about that?
You think you'll be seeing her again?
Quick, one more. He mustn't see.
Am I human?
Sometimes.
And last night wasn't good.
There were some other interpretations relating to different types of alcohol, beer as friendship and wine as romance, that were mostly based on their usual cultural connotations. Two bros out for drinks? Of course they're having beer. At least until John spikes them with whiskey, for some reason. The same goes for Lestrade, the broiest character on the show, repeatedly drinking beer. Wine and romance? I feel like that's so obvious I don't really need to justify that one.
More wine, Doctor?
You're trying to get me drunk, Doctor.
More wine?
No, I'm good with water, thanks.
Right.
Ah, I chose this wine. It's bloody awful.
We have a client.
What, in your bedroom?
But we're not here for that. We're here for the heavy hitters. Coffee as straight romance and tea as gay romance. How on earth did we get there? Let's start with coffee. The connection between coffee and straight romance is made pretty early on in the first episode.
When you're finished,
Wearing lipstick. You weren't wearing lipstick before.
I was wondering if you'd like to have coffee.
Black, 2 sugars, please. I'll be upstairs.
But it turns out that's not quite Sherlock's cup of...
Okay.
The connection is made a couple other times.
You had a disappointing breakfast and a cup of black coffee. The girl in the seat across the aisle fancied you. Although you were initially keen, you've now changed your mind.
Darling, they didn't have any ground coffee, so I just got normal.
Oh, could you be a love and put some coffee on?
Sure, right, yeah.
And as a point of interest, Anderson describes his theory for how Sherlock survived, which includes a kiss between Sherlock and Molly while drinking coffee with Lestrade.
Absent friends. Sherlock.
Which leads to this frankly baffling transition that honestly makes no sense if it isn't implying that John is trying to straighten himself out, trying to move on from Sherlock by proposing to his girlfriend Mary. Either way, can I just say that this transition is really weird and off-putting and always has been? Coffee here is really only notable in its opposition to the other binary choice that's usually presented. It's a standard getting to know you question. coffee, or tea? And it doesn't take much to make that question itself an innuendo for sexual preference.
I don't suppose that you want to have a drink? Not tea, obviously.
Not much of a coffee drinker. I like a cup of tea, or a pot, nice big pot of tea. A pot of tea is your only man.
Sir, poor, it's not what it seemed.
What? No. Connor, I think a certain degree of discretion.
I'm never gonna say anything, sir.
About anything? Ever, sir. I might get a cup of tea. Do you want a cup of tea? Do you want one? Yeah.
See, again, not even unique to Sherlock. To clarify, both of the characters in that scene from the 2016 film Handsome Devil are gay. They both just saw each other at a gay bar and are talking about being gay and closeted. Okay, but where's this connection between tea and gay romance on Sherlock coming from? The answer to that question lies in another Holmes adaptation, The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes. The film both Mark and Stephen have called their favorite film of all time.
What is your favorite film?
I wish I'd chosen a film with a shorter title. Done. I think Mark said The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes.
I think Stephen said The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes.
Both reveal at the same time?
That is beyond tragic.
Amazing.
And one of the main influences on BBC Sherlock.
And principally, I think, because it's, along with the Basil Rathbone films, it's the great influence on our TV series. Because it's precisely as reverent as Conan Doyle was himself, i.e. not very. The parody is so sublime, but at its heart, it's deeply touching.
We will be revisiting that in a bit when we come back to discuss authorial intent. But for now, let's just assume that given that it's their favorite film, they at least know the dialogue of the film, the memorable scenes. Yeah? So one of the most infamous scenes in The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes is the one where Holmes and Watson go to see Swan Lake. They were invited because the lead dancer, the great Petrova, is looking for a man to father her child. When Holmes realizes this, he gets very uncomfortable and begins looking for any way out of the situation, protesting that there must be other options. The director admits Holmes was not their first choice. The others did not go well, particularly their last choice, Tchaikovsky.
It was catastrophe.
Why?
We don't know. Because Tchaikovsky is... How shall I put it? Women, not his glass of tea.
Petrova continues to insist that Holmes come to Venice with her and have sex with her for a week, and he'll even get a Stradivarius as payment. Seems like a pretty sweet deal, but Holmes is still reluctant for some reason. When the director asks if Holmes finds Petrova attractive, Watson bursts into the room, and Holmes finally finds a way out of the situation with a very telling lie.
You see, I am not a free man.
Not free? But you are a bachelor.
A bachelor living with another bachelor for the last 5 years. 5 very happy years.
You mean you and Dr. Watson... He is your glass of tea?
If you want to be picturesque about it.
Billy Wilder has said that when planning the film, he originally wanted to confirm that Holmes was gay and in love with Watson, but was unable to do so due to the motion picture code in place at the time the film was made.
I should have been more daring with The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, but unfortunately, the son of Conan Doyle was there. I wanted to make Holmes a homosexual. That's why he's on dope.
So this is about as close as we get to a confirmation. Well, with the exception of one other scene.
Let me ask you a question. I hope I'm not being presumptuous, but there have been women in your life?
The answer is yes. You're being presumptuous.
The writers know this.
They gently take the mickey out of Sherlock Holmes, in the way that you can only do with something you really adore. It's a fantastically melancholy film. The relationship between Sherlock and Watson is treated beautifully. Sherlock effectively falls in love with him in the film, but it's so desperately unspoken. There's an amazing scene where, to get out of a situation where a Russian ballerina wants Sherlock to father her child, he claims Watson and he are gay. Watson is outraged and, when he calms down, speaks to the women all over the world who could attest to his sexuality. He says to Sherlock, "You do too, don't you?" Holmes is silent, and Watson says, "Am I being presumptuous? There have been women, haven't there?" Holmes says, "The answer is yes. You're being presumptuous." Sensational.
One of the major plot points of the second episode, The Blind Banker, centers around a series of artifacts of cultural significance. I would argue that you can see this as a symbol for the home stories, that one of the characters is obsessed with restoring. To restore these teapots, rather than being kept safely behind glass, coming back to that, they instead need to be brought out and touched, handled. Specifically, they need to have tea poured on them.
The more the teapot is used, the more beautiful it becomes. Some things aren't supposed to sit behind glass. They're made to be touched, to be handled.
Well, I can't see how a tiny splash of tea's going to help.
Sometimes you have to look hard at something to see its value.
If Sherlock was setting out to tell a love story between Holmes and Watson, along the lines of what Private Life wanted to do, that would be a clever way of tipping off the audience early on. Or you can look at all the times that John and Sherlock are drinking tea together, or that tea is associated with Sherlock or Moriarty, the characters most commonly read as gay.
John, have a cup of tea. Make yourself at home.
Please, sit down. Oh, if you'd like some tea, I can call the maid.
I had some at the palace.
I know.
I had a tea too at the palace, if anyone's interested.
You need me, or you're nothing. Because we're just alike, you and I.
You bring me tea in the morning.
Where do you think it came from?
I don't know. I just thought it sort of happened.
I've been rushed off my feet making tea.
Why'd you make him tea?
I don't know. I just sort of do.
But there isn't an obvious dialogue cue for drink code. Or at least, there wasn't.
Yes, but I'm very busy at the moment. I have to drink a cup of tea.
This cup of tea code?
It's a cup of tea.
Because you might prefer some coffee.
No discussion of drink code would be complete without a mention of the Q&A Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat did in late 2016. One Tumblr user asked if the writers preferred coffee or tea. Stephen Moffat responded, "Coffee. Mark handles the tea." In case you had forgotten, in the intervening years, Mark Gatiss is a gay man. Still sticking a giant pin in that authorial intent discussion, but I wanted to mention this all the same while we were here. This is the first symbol that is more or less unique to this particular story. I'm not aware of any kind of broader pattern of phones representing hearts in film or literature, but it's an easy connection to draw when you think about it. It's an object that you carry with you everywhere, that is extremely personal and personalized. It's the way you connect with the people closest to you, and a person could probably learn quite a bit about you if they had unrestricted access to your phone for even a few minutes. For this one, we do again have an obvious dialogue cue, and again, we can thank Irene Adler.
But this is far more intimate. This is your heart, and you should never let it rule your head.
That seems clear enough, so let's try applying it elsewhere. Let's start with the fact that the first thing John does upon meeting Sherlock is to offer him his phone.
Here. Use mine.
And we learn later that same episode that John's phone comes with some troubled history.
That's only next week wouldn't treat as one luxury item like this, so it's had a previous owner.
Or this scene.
Careful.
Or this one.
Thank you.
And more broadly in this context, you could read a conversation happening over the phone as a heart-to-heart.
Are you sure tonight's a danger night?
No, but then I never am. You have to stay with him, John.
I can't come down, so we'll just have to do it like this.
What's going on?
An apology.
It's Sherlock, John. Sherlock. John, you have to answer it.
That is by no means an exhaustive list of these scenes, but again, having now written a piece of fiction with this symbol, it isn't particularly hard to use. I think one of the only ways you can make this connection more blatant is if you, I don't know, had a shot with hearts literally flying out of a phone. No, that would be so ridiculously obvious. That would never happen. That's foreshadowing. Which, of course, symbolizes the elephant in the room, or the obvious truth going unaddressed. Since this was specifically brought up in The Sign of Three, the episode that ought to have been about John and Mary's love, but instead was about John and Sherlock's.
So know this, today you sit between the woman you have made your wife and the man you have saved. In short, the two people who love you most in all this world. And of course, I have to mention the elephant in the room.
Well, people were suspicious of elephants after that. Take this scene in The Abominable Bride, where the queer subtext gets so blatant that a man gets on his knees and fillets a gun. And it's too much for our poor friend the elephant in the room to handle.
It's on the tip.
don't worry, she's back by the end of the episode.
From a drop of water, a logician should be able to infer the possibility of an Atlantic or a Niagara.
Elephants were also associated with a man at John's wedding not happy with his current partner.
More importantly, his girlfriend's wearing brand new uncomfortable underwear and hasn't bothered to pick this thread off the top of his jacket or point out the grease smudge on the back of his neck. Currently, he's going home alone.
We'll revisit the idea of mirror characters in a minute, but hey, maybe someone being unhappy in their relationship is related to the elephant in the room somehow. We also get elephants associated with Moran, a character highly anticipated by fans before his introduction, since in the books he was Moriarty's right-hand man and his best sniper. The version we got was a bit of a letdown. Of course, that's assuming that just because he has the name Moran, he's the real Moran figure of the story. Perhaps that's another elephant in the room. There's also an elephant on Anderson's theory wall, when we know that there are particular theories he is unwilling to address.
What? Are you out of your mind?
There's also an elephant on Mycroft's fridge in The Six Thatchers. And there's one particularly memorable scene with elephants in The Final Problem, but we'll come back to that particular scene much, much later. This technique wasn't as well known outside the fandom, but it's still fresh in my mind having recently written a story with it. Essentially, the idea is that a specific type of crime being committed can tell you something about the situation the characters are facing. The most well-known example of this in the TJLC reading was locked rooms as a type of emotional barrier, most clearly demonstrated in The Blind Banker.
Sherlock, you okay? Yeah, anytime you feel like letting me in. Can you not keep doing this, please? Anytime you want to include me.
There are other locked room mysteries throughout the show, and I think that's a good lead into this next idea, which is that perhaps the method of a murder can have significance too.
Violence is one of the most personal and even intimate acts between human beings, but it can also be cultural and societal in its implications. It can be symbolic, thematic, biblical, Shakespearean, romantic, allegorical, transcendent. Violence in real life just is. Violence in literature, though, while it is literal, is usually also something else. That same punch in the nose may be a metaphor.
Man stabbed to death. No murder weapon. Don't look from the inside. Only one way in or out of here.
Sherlock? He's still breathing. The belt would bind the flesh together when it was tight.
Exactly.
When you took it off.
Delayed action stabbing.
So like with some parts of Drink Code, reading into murder methods relies quite a bit on cultural connotation. But I think you already know most of these if you think about it. If you heard a song and a love was described as being a poison, or like an explosion, or like being stabbed with a knife, or like a shotgun shot to the heart, you probably already know intuitively what that means. In this method, you just apply that to the crime. So for example, a delayed action stabbing is an emotional injury that occurs at one point.
Okay, hold it there. I want to get this shot. The newlyweds. Just the bride and groom, please.
But is fully felt later.
Baker Street, behind closed curtains. Mrs. Hudson came in one time. Don't know how those rumors started.
And the tie between violence and the characters' hearts is made explicit in the dialogue.
I will burn the heart out of you.
He says after putting John Watson in explosives, and Sherlock is about to react like this.
All right. Are you all right?
And someone will later stick John in an actual fire.
What does it mean?
Oh my God.
John!
John.
John.
What might that mean about Sherlock's heart? Let's stick with heart injuries since that's a particular preoccupation of mine at the moment. This is another Literature 101 take. If a writer tells you that a character is sick or injured in their heart or chest, that is almost always a reference to their emotional state.
When we fall in love, we feel it in our hearts. When we lose a love, we feel heartbroken. When overwhelmed by strong emotion, we feel our hearts are full to bursting. Everybody knows this. Everybody intuitively senses this. What, then, can the writer do with this knowledge? The writer can use heart ailments as a kind of shorthand for the character, which is probably what happens most often.
When we meet John, his heart has already been injured.
You did get shot, though.
Sorry?
In Afghanistan, there was an actual wound.
Oh, yeah, the shoulder.
Shoulder, I thought so.
No, you didn't.
The left one.
Lucky guess.
Sherlock will also later be shot in the chest by John's wife, and he'll imagine it happening while she's in her wedding dress. And the villain did threaten to burn the heart out of the main hero. It seems reasonable to draw this connection on this show. My personal favorite literary device. A mirror character is a side character that reveals information about a main one, either through their similarities or their differences. The ones that reveal something through a difference are also sometimes called a foil. Much like a foil character mimics tinfoil used by jewelers to emphasize the shine of a gemstone with their differences, a mirror character reflects a character's traits to highlight the similarities. Mirror characters, also known as parallel characters in some literary circles, almost certainly share personality traits, values, similar skill sets, and possibly even goals and likely a narrative arc. While a mirror is seen as the literary opposite of a foil, in truth, the tropes often overlap, and a character's foil and mirror can be the same character. Again, this is pretty standard literary fare. Maybe not quite to the extent it was thought to be used on BBC Sherlock, but common enough. These characters come in all sorts, most commonly rivalries, but not always.
Hamilton, come in. Have you met Burke?
Yes, sir. We keep meeting.
So let me simply add that it's my very good honor to meet you, and you may call me V.
I'm Evie.
Evie? Evie. Of course you are.
I've been thinking about us, Tom. About binaries that form the nature of things. Ones and zeros, light and dark, choice and its absence, Anderson and Smith.
In Sherlock, you have a few minor characters who seem to exist to reveal something about one of the two main leads. On top of that, you get all of these recurring situations again and again in the background. And maybe that's because there are only so many scenarios to set up a crime, but maybe not. Sherlock makes frequent use of shots that either include reflections or glass distorting things. It's one of the most common visual tricks on the show. In general, including mirrors in a shot adds a lot of extra work behind the scenes. You have to be sure that nothing like the camera or the director or a crew member or anything else that would take the audience out of the experience is showing up in the reflection. That's part of why it's so notable that Sherlock includes shots with mirrors so often. It's significantly increasing the workload. Same goes for all the glass, which smudges easily. They're probably having to clean some of these surfaces between takes. It was important to them that these shots were included for one reason or another. A lot of people thought it was being done to allude both to the idea that some things aren't meant to sit behind glass and to the use of mirroring on the show. There are potential mirror characters everywhere, and I do mean everywhere. One can always find a mirror if one tries. The tip-off can be anything. A shared name, a similar style of dress or appearance, same occupation, the list goes on. But I'll stick to some of the most obvious. So let's begin with Irene Adler as a mirror character for Sherlock. I would argue that this one is almost certainly intentional. When Irene is introduced, we cut between Sherlock and Irene mirroring each other's actions while they're both placed in front of literal mirrors at multiple points.
Shade? Blood.
The characters in the scene happen to mention subtext.
I always hear punch me in the face when you're speaking, but it's usually subtext.
A bit later, we see Irene wearing both Sherlock's coat and Sherlock's dressing gown, wearing his clothes and looking a lot like him. Maybe this is meant to be romantic. They are so much the same that they are the only match for one another. Maybe it's meant to imply that if Irene admits she's gay and seems to have something going on with her assistant, let's do the innkeepers next, mostly because I love this shot. That is a lot of mirrors. The owners of the Cross Keys Inn, Billy and Gary, are a happy gay couple living in domestic bliss, and we get comparisons between the two of them and Sherlock and John.
Sorry we couldn't do a double room for you boys.
That's fine. We're not...
He's a snorer.
Hey,
is yours a snorer?
Got any crisps?
In this episode, you might notice that John switches his speech patterns to say the filler word ta a lot, something he doesn't really say outside of this episode, but you know who does? Gary.
Ta. Oh, Ta. I'll just get your change. Ta.
And of course, Sherlock's actual first name is William, so Billy would seem like an obvious play on that.
Thanks, Bill.
There are quite a few Billys on this show.
It's a skull.
Friend of mine. When I say friend.
Thank you, Billy.
The best man.
What do you think?
Billy Kincaid.
Nice observational skills, Billy.
Mr. Holmes, telegram, Mr. Holmes.
How about another happy couple that happens to look a lot like Sherlock and John?
Blooming things. I said, why don't you get a chain, wear 'em around your neck? It's what? Like Larry Grayson.
It's pointed out on the show that the Holmes parents aren't a neat parallel to John and Mary.
You're the sane one, aren't you?
Aren't you?
But they still are.
He's lovely mum and dad, fine example of married life.
Mr. Holmes in particular looks a lot like John, which makes this line noteworthy.
Beauty is a construct based entirely on childhood impressions, influences, and role models.
Because Sherlock's father would have been one of his childhood influences. What might that imply? Let's go back to potential romantic rivals. We get another blatant Sherlock mirror in John's girlfriend in A Scandal in Belgravia, Jeanette. right down to the hair, the cheekbones, and the coat with the collar turned up.
No, I'll do anything for you. Just tell me what it is I'm not doing. Tell me.
Don't make me compete with Sherlock Holmes.
Once we get to series 3, there's a constant contrast between Mary and Sherlock. There are more similarities than differences between the two at first.
I agree, I'm the best thing that could have happened to you. Sorry.
Sorry, got a dash. I think I left my riding crop in the mortuary.
But as series 3 continues, the two characters begin to diverge. The greatest point of contrast is the things they will or won't do for John Watson. When it looks like John wants Sherlock out of his life, Sherlock lets him go. But Mary can't bear the thought.
Because John can't ever know that I lied to him. It would break him and I would lose him forever. And Sherlock, I will never let that happen.
Or the fact that Sherlock, and even John's previous, ex-Commander Sholto, would do anything for John's happiness, even if it makes themselves miserable.
Mr. Holmes, you and I are similar, I think.
Yes, I think we are. We wouldn't do that, would we? You and me. We would never do that to John Watson.
But not Mary.
No, Mrs. Watson. You won't.
It's specifically their respective feelings for John that are being contrasted here. This comparison is also made repeatedly through dialogue.
God, I know, 6 months of bristly kisses for me and then his nibs turns up.
You'd still have a future with Mary.
Yeah, I know.
Oh, Sherlock. Neither of us were the first, you know.
And I want to be up there with the two people that I love and care about most in the world.
Yes. In short, the two people who love you most in all this world.
She has completely turned my life around. Over the last few years, there are two people who have done that.
So here's a few things you need to know about the man we both love.
John's feelings for Mary and Sherlock are constantly equated. It certainly seems like the implication of that could be that John has romantic interest in both. Or if you read this line of John's a certain way, that John is using Mary to divert his feelings from the person he's actually attracted to.
You're abnormally attracted to dangerous situations and people.
But she wasn't supposed to be like that. Why is she like that?
We also have a side character who is interested in Sherlock romantically to show us more about how John feels about him. Molly Hooper. Right from the beginning, we see a marked difference in the way that Sherlock handles romantic overtures from John and from Molly. He turns both of them down in this episode, but he does it with John a lot more delicately.
I was wondering if you'd like to have coffee.
Black, 2 sugars, please. I'll be upstairs.
Okay.
John, I think you should know that I consider myself married to my work, and while I'm flattered by your interest, I'm really not looking for anything. No.
Both characters are jealous of Sherlock's apparent preoccupation with Irene Adler.
Do you have a reply?
How did Sherlock recognize her from not her face?
Has he ever had any kind of girlfriend, boyfriend, a relationship ever? Do you think you'll be seeing her again?
Whose phone is it?
A woman's?
Your girlfriend?
Both of them change things about their appearance for Sherlock.
What happened to the lipstick?
It wasn't working for me.
Really? I thought it was a big improvement. Mouth's too small now.
So you shaved it off then?
Yeah, wasn't working for me.
Yeah, I'm glad.
We didn't like it?
I prefer my doctor's clean shaven.
Both of them gain weight when they're in relationships with villainous characters.
And domestic bliss must suit you, Molly. You've put on 3 pounds since I last saw you.
2.5.
Oh, 3. You've got on 7 pounds since you got married, and the cycling isn't doing it.
It's actually 4 pounds.
Mary and I think 7. See you later.
And of course, the fact that both of them get engaged in the same episode. And it's made blatantly obvious that Molly is not over Sherlock.
Oh, God. Is it serious?
Well, I'm moving on. Is it serious, you see?
Yeah. I've moved on.
We're getting married. Well, I'm going to ask anyway.
So soon after Sherlock?
Well, yes.
And congratulations, by the way.
He's not from work. We met through friends. Old-fashioned way.
After all, not all the men you fall for can turn out to be sociopaths.
Is everyone I've ever met a psychopath?
Yes.
Maybe it's just my type.
2 episodes later, they're both miserable in their respective relationships, or out of them.
Sorry your engagement's over. I'm fairly grateful for the lack of a ring.
Stop it. Just stop it.
I might as well ask you why you started cycling to work.
No, we're not playing this game.
You keep your shirts folded, ready to pack.
Like I said, I'm sticking to the most obvious here, but mirror characters are all over the place. That's part of how Natty came up with M-theory to begin with. She noticed a pattern of cases where the couple was foiled by a brother roped in with the villains.
You knew him well when you were living back in China?
He's my brother.
I just got out of my depth. I owe people thousands. Serious people.
Which nicely segues to a topic that's similar to mirror characters as stand-ins. For what? Depends on the character. This was my particular pet reading during the time I made TJLC Explained, and was the one I have felt the most embarrassment about reading into in the years since. But in revisiting it, I can see how I got there, and I still find this theory compelling. The idea was that not only was M theory, or the idea that there's an elaborate power play between Mycroft and Moriarty going on in the background of the show, correct and intentional, it was there to say something bigger about Holmes and his various adaptations. Here's a very broad overview of that reading. The overarching villain of Sherlock, at least for the first 2 series and then teased frequently thereafter, is James Moriarty, who is first introduced as a fan of Sherlock Holmes.
Got yourself a fan. That website of yours, your fan told me about it.
My fan would sponsor a serial killer.
You'd be a fan of Sherlock Holmes.
The one who told you about me, my fan. I want a name.
It seemed reasonable that they might have been using Moriarty to say something about Holmes fans. The same goes for other Holmes adapters, the storytellers.
Hello. Are you ready for the story?
I'm the storyteller. It's on DVD. Complete your story. You gotta admit that's sexier.
And Moriarty is constantly associated with the media and media figures, which likewise tend to be placed in a less than positive light.
Another photo of you with the...
This is too much. We need to be more careful.
But I bet the money was good. But not so good he didn't want to sell his story.
What would I need proof for? I'm in news, you moron. I don't have to prove it, I just have to print it.
Not just that, in The Abominable Bride, Moriarty is treated like a corrupting force acting on the story, the virus in its data.
He's the crack in the lens, the fly in the ointment, the virus in the data.
You once called your brain a hard drive. Well, say hello to the virus.
So if all of that was intentional, what might it be that the writers are trying to say about Holmes fans and adapters? What are they getting wrong? What has been corrupting this story since the start? Could it have something to do with Holmes and Watson's relationship?
What would you like me to make him say next?
Aren't ordinary people adorable? Well, you know, you've got John.
Well, look how you care about John Watson. Your damsel in distress.
This is how we end, you and I. Always here, always together.
That's what I thought at the time. The other key player in M theory, Mycroft, seemed like a pretty obvious stand-in for the writers of Sherlock, given that he's played by one of them, and the writers have admitted that they have used him in that way at a few points.
It was a thrilling moment, and you get to say it.
Oh, it was Rupert, and then when we did this version, you said, well, it's clearly the writers talking.
So it should be.
In the scene at the beginning where I'm mouthing the words of the film noir that Mycroft's watching, that I'm mouthing dialogue I've written for myself to laugh about. This is absolutely insane.
Again, the idea of characters as self-inserts for the author is nothing new.
Did you base your main character on yourself?
There is a lot of me in it. Maybe a little too much.
So my idea was that Mycroft getting roped into working with Moriarty was a reference to Mark and Stephen wanting to tell a romance between Sherlock and John, working behind the scenes to accomplish it, but being prevented from acting freely by what Moriarty represents, for the time being, until the truth could be revealed.
Tradition, John. Our traditions define us.
So total silence is traditional, is it?
Mycroft has been looking for this opportunity for a long time.
There are also a few characters who you can see as stand-ins for the fans of BBC Sherlock. Some of them are blatant.
If you're not going to take it seriously, Laura, you can...
I do take it seriously. I don't think we should wear hats.
I founded the Empty Hearse so like-minded people could meet, discuss theories...
These fans are dismissed by the show. Almost everyone picks up on that. But some people wondered if that was because these fans were focusing on the wrong things. There is another group of fans that are treated much more positively. The fans wanting to find and explain the themes, because people tend to miss that kind of thing.
We have this website. It explains the true meaning of comic books, because people miss a lot of the themes. But then all the comic books start coming true.
Oh, interesting.
Which I bring up here because there's a scene in The Abominable Bride where Mycroft, played by Mark, speaks with Wilder, presumably a nod to Billy Wilder, who informs him that Mr. Mellis, that fan trying to find the true meaning of his favorite series, would like to have a word.
Thank you, Wilder.
Also, Mr. Mellis to see you, Mr. Holmes.
Give me 5 minutes. I have a wager to win. Better make that 15.
That's a lot of things going on there at once. Again, putting a pin in that. There was another scene in this episode that people likewise read as Mark breaking the fourth wall through Mycroft, when he spoke about their way of life that must change, a war they must lose.
But these enemies, how are we to defeat them if you won't tell us about them?
We don't defeat them. We most certainly lose to them.
Why?
Because they are right and we are wrong.
We later find out that this is about a group of suffragettes, but look at how they're introduced.
This is the heart of it all, John. The heart of the conspiracy.
A lot of TJLC homies looked at this scene and this heavy-handed dialogue about how these women were being unfairly ignored and lied to.
The women we have lied to, betrayed, the women we have ignored and disparaged.
Well, at the time, it seemed like a direct reference to the way the writers were treating TJLC fans in interviews, particularly because these brides are associated with mirrors and glass, and those things are such a big part of the TJLC reading.
A simple reflection in glass of a living, breathing person. Their only mistake was breaking the glass when they removed it.
And I can admit, maybe it was silly to think they were aware of TJLC and would write it into the show. It's not like there are any other scenes that are even more blatant than that, right? Certainly they wouldn't include the author stand-in, holding a pen to remind you that he's the author stand-in, smugly mention that he loves acronyms and secret societies.
Oh, good. I love an acronym. All the best secret societies have them.
The heart of the conspiracy. And I think that's where I want to leave this part of the discussion. There are other methods I could talk about, score analysis and narrative structure, which we will be coming back to in the last video, looking for potential references to other texts, and analyzing the lighting. By the way, TJLC did in fact coin that bisexual lighting you've been hearing so much about. But I think that last scene with Mark is the perfect time to raise the question you've probably been asking. That's all well and good, and maybe even clever, but is any of that what the writers meant? What did Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat intend when they wrote BBC Sherlock? It's a more complicated question to answer than you might think. To quote the great Oscar Wilde, the truth is never pure and rarely simple. But before we get into that, I want to clarify how I'm going to be approaching this discussion of the writers. Because one of the other things I regret is the way I thought of Mark and Stephen. I idolize them, which sounds like a positive thing, but I think at the end of the day, that can be rather dehumanizing. To project all of your values onto another person like that. When that person inevitably doesn't live up to the ideal in your head, I think it naturally turns to its inverse, vilification. And I have seen this a lot throughout the years. People saying that because Series 4 went the way it did, Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat are evil people or just incompetent idiots. And I don't think either of those things are true. I want to play a couple of clips from an interview that came out just a week or so after The Final Problem aired that did a lot to inform my approach here. Let's start with Mark, who I think correctly identifies what is going on when people get so emotionally invested in something like TJLC.
Well, I was talking to David Arnold the other day, our composer, who had this very interesting theory that maybe we're all feeling so powerless about the state of the world that there's a sort of sublimation of that into people getting very, very vociferous and angry about things they feel they do have some control about. And that might be, a book, a film, a TV series. So that maybe there's something in that people actually get slightly disproportionately furious about something that doesn't really matter that much.
I think he has it right. I think that's exactly what happened. And I think it's very astute of him to recognize that when so many others have not been able to identify that underlying anxiety, the humanity on our end. I'm going to follow that with Stephen's response.
I don't think it's a positive thing or a positive side of humanity that sometimes people are exceptionally mean about human beings who make a TV show. I don't think that's a good thing. I don't think it's the worst thing that ever happened. It's kind of fine. We are all guilty of being mean about people we don't actually stand in front of. Most of us are human enough that if we meet the hurtable gaze of another person, we refine and moderate our behavior to accommodate their feelings and their right to courtesy and respect. That's a good thing about us. The fact is, because when you take away that reality, you suddenly find a limitless capacity for being horrible that you don't have in real life. So I don't know if it's symptomatic of us all being evil or anything. I think it's symptomatic that anonymity and the concealed face of the person you're pretending to hate makes certain things possible.
And I think that's true too, that a lot of this dehumanization comes when we forget that the people involved with the stories we enjoy are people, flawed, but deserving of kindness and compassion. And you might be pointing out that they don't treat their fans that way. And they have indeed sometimes been rude and dismissive towards fans. But the thing is, I don't think I'm in a position to criticize them for that. At the height of this channel's popularity, I was nearing, 20,000 subscribers, and I couldn't handle that level of scrutiny. I can't imagine what having millions of eyes on your work and constant questions and criticisms and expectations placed on you feels like. So even though I have what I would describe as philosophical differences with Mark and Steven, I'm going to extend them a lot of grace here. While writing the script, I imagined how I would phrase things if I knew Mark or Steven would watch this. Not because I'm expecting them to, I'm very much not, but because that helped me keep in mind the hurtful gaze of the human beings behind the writing. So, the big question: did Mark and Steven set out to write a love story between Sherlock Holmes and John Watson? They contradict themselves constantly in interviews on almost every point related to this show. But there are 3 things they have been absolutely consistent on. 1. James Moriarty died on the roof of St. Bart's Hospital. 2. Sherlock and John are never going to be together romantically on their show. And 3. To prevent their story from being spoiled, they lie. Constantly.
Moriarty is a fascinating thing in that in our sea of ongoing lies, one thing we've genuinely been completely consistent about is telling people he's dead, but no one believes it.
Well, you expected that because we explicitly told you that's what it was. Yes. It shows the power of lying.
It's all about, in fact, it's all about the rug. It is. It's actually about the rug. If I were organising you a surprise party, and which would be in itself a surprise, I suppose, and you asked me, are you organising me a surprise party? I'd say no, because that's kind of what you do when you're doing things like that. So we either say nothing at all, we literally lock ourselves away, or we're not going to tell you what happens next. Of course.
There's no point in trying to coax it, because it would spoil it.
Yeah.
So in the end, you end up... I remember doing Graham Norton's show a couple of years ago, and every single question that was emailed to me, I basically went, no comment.
And just because no comment is itself an answer, sometimes you just think, well, to hell with it, it's fiction. I'll make up some more right now, and I just tell a straightforward porky. Then in fairness to me, I've always said that's exactly what I'm doing. Sometimes I said that. I didn't San Diego and said, I am lying to you. I'm lying to you right now. Why are you trusting what I say when I'm lying? And they still quote me. Interesting though, isn't it? Because we both now have a reputation, which is not really true, about how we are enjoying doing this. The truth is, it's the only way to keep a secret is to make everybody distrust everything.
Presented in that order, it's going to seem like I'm implying that I think the first 2 statements are lies. And that was the approach I took before. I took for granted that when the writers said they weren't going to do it, they must have been lying, because the show they wrote seemed to contradict what they were saying in interviews. And that's the bit of my approach to this channel that I regret the most. Not thinking that they were lying, I think that was reasonable, but completely dismissing the notion that they might be telling the truth. Because they might be. They insist they are, that as much as they lie about other things, John and Sherlock's relationship is not one of them. And I think being so dismissive of that possibility was the biggest way I set myself, and likewise my audience, up for failure. But is that the end of the discussion? They've said they aren't doing it, that's that. Not quite, because there are still a plethora of inconsistencies even there. Let's break it down, starting with the question of whether or not Sherlock experiences attraction at all. Their answers change depending on when you ask them. Sometimes he doesn't.
Sherlock specifically says in episode 1, when John asks him if he has a girlfriend or a boyfriend, he says no. All that matters to me is brain work. Everything else is just transport. His body is an appendage to him.
and sometimes he does. Sherlock Holmes, again, must have sexual impulses, because human beings tend to. Most human beings, not absolutely all, but that's the majority. The fact is, he decides to put all that in an iron box to make his brain work better. Of course, the fact that the iron box bounces around and shakes and bangs from the inside is what makes the story interesting. He wants to rise above us like a snow-capped mountain, but he's actually a volcano. And that's where the story is. That's where the story is. You know, you shove Irene Adler in front of him, and he falls apart just like most men would. And sometimes he's had sex.
Is Sherlock Holmes a virgin or not? You can't ever establish it. Oddly enough, they did the same in Private Life. They had a scene which established that he had done the deed, didn't they? But they cut it.
Yeah.
Same thing. It's we just don't know. I personally can't imagine that he is, but you can't ever confirm it.
And sometimes he hasn't. We walk into that one all the time. It's a funny thing when a character for over 100 years has been saying, I don't do that at all. He's been saying it for over 100 years. He's not interested in sex. He's willfully staying away from that to keep his brain pure. A Victorian belief that, but everyone wants to believe he's gay. He's not gay. He's not straight. And Dr. Watson is very clear that he prefers women. People want to fantasize about it. It's fine. But it's not in the show. And sometimes he's in love with Irene Adler. Hey guys, editing Rebecca here. So quick heads up, this next interview I'm going to read out doesn't only say that Sherlock is in love with Irene Adler, but I need to include it, and this is the best place for it. Stephen essentially gives every single answer to the question at once, so I'm sorry it doesn't say exactly what I said it would in the original recording, but I want to show you this because it's bananas. Alright, bye. Hopefully you won't be seeing me in my pajamas again. Holmes and Watson's relationship is always definitely a love story. I don't see why that means that sex has to be involved. What a weirdly sexualized world we live in where you insist they must be having sex as well. Why would they? John isn't wired that way, whatever Sherlock is. Sherlock Holmes is indifferent to sex. So is Irene. She uses sex to get what she wants. And John happily has a string of girlfriends. Sex is not really the issue among any of these people. Love is. Infatuation is. I think John Watson is infatuated with and fascinated by Sherlock Holmes. I think Sherlock Holmes absolutely relies completely and utterly on John Watson and is devoted to him. I think Sherlock is infatuated to the point that he can barely function around Irene Adler. Who says any of them are having sex with each other? Why is sex so important? I think we're obsessed with it, to the point where I know a lot of people are saying, well, Sherlock and John clearly love each other, they must be having sex. But you can love someone without fancying them. If you're not wired to fancy someone, you just won't. But what's that got to do with it? Really, what's that got to do with the important relationships? We know that love grows, sex sort of wanes. Older people, you don't have sex as much later on as you do at the beginning. We know it's the lesser thing. I always say you have love stories and sex scenes. That's the difference of stature in their lives. And other times, of course he's not. So is Sherlock in love? Moffat and Gatiss bristle at the suggestion, describing A Scandal in Belgravia as a non-love story. This isn't Sherlock in love, claims Gatiss, but rather Sherlock and love. It doesn't have to be as mundane as a love story, sniffs Moffat. Then there's the question of the existence of subtext on BBC Sherlock at all. What do they have to say about that? Well, sometimes they claim it's not a part of the story at all. There's nothing there. It's our show, and that's what these characters are like. If people want to do that on websites, that's absolutely fine, but there's nothing there. And sometimes it's there as a joke. But the joke is that everyone assumes that in the 21st century, that these two blokes living together are a couple, what they wouldn't have assumed in the 19th century. And sometimes it's there because they enjoy playing with homoeroticism. No, I don't think I'd like to make a kind of gay program. It's much more interesting when it's not about a single issue. And equally, I find flirting with homoeroticism in Sherlock much more interesting. Of course, this reflects the grand picture of everyone's strange makeup. There are good gay people and bad gay people. I wouldn't like to make an issue film around the culture of being gay. I'd quite like to do something about a quite happy, ordinary gay person who's just incidentally gay. For example, a 3-part thriller for ITV where the lead character just happens to be gay. When they finally go home, say 45 minutes in, and they had a same-sex partner. That, to me, would be genuinely progressive. It wouldn't be a 3-part gay thriller for ITV, it would be that this character just happened to be gay. Or because it's part of the inspiration they took from the private life of Sherlock Holmes. The template for us was the Billy Wilder film The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, which deliberately plays with the idea that Holmes might be gay. We've done the same thing, deliberately played with it. Although it's absolutely clearly not the case. He's only a brain. Everything else is transport to him. And John clearly says, I'm not gay, we're not together. Except they never actually said that about Private Life. No, case in point. A garbled mistranslation of what I said. Except they did.
The whole idea of John and Sherlock being mistaken for a couple in our show is inspired by the Billy Wilder film, The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, which we love to distraction. And in that, Sherlock gets out of an awkward situation by claiming that he and Dr. Watson are a couple. So we sort of ran with the same joke.
And on and on and on. And this isn't even getting into the places where what they say in interviews blatantly contradicts what happens on the show. Like Stephen Moffat inexplicably claiming that the question of who Sherlock and John want to date never comes up on the show.
The reality of shows like Sherlock and Doctor Who is the subject of who you prefer to date is unlikely to come up in the middle of the crisis, We're being attacked by insects from the 9th dimension. I like to date my own sex. Is that why? I don't think this is strictly relevant right now, because it doesn't come up in normal conversation, and there aren't any normal conversations in Sherlock or Doctor Who.
When it does. In every episode.
So you've got a boyfriend?
No.
Right, okay. Actually, I've got a date.
What?
To where two people who like each other go out and have fun.
That's what I was suggesting.
I think he wants to be distracted. I hope you'll be very happy together.
Has he ever had any kind of girlfriend, boyfriend, a relationship ever?
I'm not actually gay.
Well, I am. Look at us both.
This is his PA.
PA?
Well, live-in PA.
Perfect.
Live in. You and John Watson, just platonic. Could I put you down for a no there as well?
Live and let live. That's my motto.
Listen to me. I am not gay.
I wish you weren't. Whatever it is you are.
You and Janine?
Yes, me and Janine.
Care to elaborate?
Damn it, Holmes, you are flesh and blood. You have feelings. You must have impulses.
I don't normally do this, but,
Well, you're gonna.
yeah.
Romantic entanglement, while fulfilling for other people,
Would complete you as a human being. But I wanted more. And you know something? I still do.
Oh, have you had sex?
Why do you ask?
The music, I've had sex.
But trying to figure out which bits of this are true and which bits of this are lies and which bits are just them trying to dodge accountability feels a lot like banging your head against a wall, so I would advise against it, and I'm going to stop that part of the discussion here. I want to shift focus to some of the interviews that seemed at the time to hint that perhaps the romance was the endgame. Take Benedict Cumberbatch describing his motivation for taking the role of Sherlock Holmes to begin with. And then I met with them, and it was only after we talked about what it would be developed into, and the relationship of Watson and Holmes and where they'd go, that I thought, yeah, this could be terrific fun. I'm going to go for it. Or Martin, I don't know, I'm just in it, Freeman, calling Sherlock a love story and the gayest show in the history of television in 2010. It's about the relationship between the two men and how it develops and how it changes. It's about the things that wind each other up and the things that they genuinely love about one another as well. It's the gayest story in the history of television. We all certainly saw it as a love story. These two people do love and kind of need each other in a slightly dysfunctional way, but it is a relationship that works. They get results. And then calling it a love story again a couple years later, but on camera this time so I can show you his tone.
Their relationship is kind of, as has been said a lot, it's a kind of love story, I mean, it's two men who really love each other and need each other and don't even necessarily want to need each other. They sort of drive each other up the wall sometimes, but they're absolutely two halves.
These statements are from the same Martin Freeman who would later go on to deny, with cursing and swearing, that he and Benedict had ever for a moment played the characters like lovers. There are other explanations for that dissonance other than TJLC. Maybe it was something that was fun to play at, but when people expected it to actually go somewhere, that was too far. Again, I'm trying to go into this with empathy for how having millions of people placing their expectations on you might feel, even when I disagree with the conclusions. The interview that I always come back to, though, is the one one given by Mark Gatiss and Stephen Moffat in late 2010, when they discussed at length their reasons for making this show, what they enjoy most about the Holmes stories, what they think is crucial for any successful Holmes adaptation to get right, and their biggest influences in making Sherlock. Some of this you'll recognize, I quoted it often in TJLC Explained, but I'm going to include a lot more of it than I have before. This comes from a place of us being fans. This wasn't a case of, let's grab that off the shelf and update it. It was, we love this, we think everybody's been getting it wrong, and we think we can get it right. Unless you think you're correcting everyone else, you shouldn't be doing something. You should be saying, now this is the way it should be done. They also had an instant chemistry, and it's very interesting that Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson are like chalk and cheese, and actually Benedict and Martin are very different people who have very different approaches to their acting, but they just connected. They just have a spark, and you could see it in the room. The room lit up, and it just altered the way he was giving the lines. They changed, and it was just there. I really do think, as I said in that panel, that the real story of Sherlock Holmes is the story of the friendship, but nobody really talks about it because it's told through the medium of detective stories. It really is. You warm to those two men who, in different ways, but they're quite difficult separately, and they adore each other. But what's the line you're always quoting? I was just thinking that, because of course we're always thinking psychically. I've forgotten the line, but Watson persuades him to go out for a walk because nothing's happening, and he says, "We walked for the most part in silence, as befits two men who know each other intimately." It's beautiful. And then they come back and it's like, you bastard, I told you! And there are those details throughout it. Doyle, despite what people tended to say about him, didn't do anything by accident. These are all very deliberate, cleverly written stories, albeit at the same speed, and the fact that it is a friendship is intentional. But there's that one moment of total affection between them that happens once and is never repeated, and it's there for a purpose. So when Sherlock Holmes works, it's when you believe in the relationship between the two of them. Nigel Bruce departed a long way from the character of Dr. Watson in the stories, but why I absolutely believe those Rathbone-Bruce films is because they're the two best friends in the world. They actually were best friends, Rathbone and Bruce, and it's on the screen. You think they love each other. Why do they love each other? Because they love each other. The other thing we must mention, because it's absolutely key for us, is the Billy Wilder film, The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, which is a masterpiece and, in so many ways, is tonally what we're trying to do. There are a lot of things that we've taken from that, and we can't say what they all are, but one of the things that Wilder and Diamond got right was the humor. The banter between the two was spot on. And again, that Colin Blakely has as big a part, and his stature within the story is every bit as big as Robert Stevens. The two of them were equals. That's always the case in successful versions of Sherlock Holmes, in my view. So what do we make of that? Well, it seems like, at first at least, they set out to do something different with this version, to correct everyone else, those other Holmes fans and adapters who were getting it wrong. The thing they wanted to get right seemed to have something to do with the influence of the masterpiece, The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, though they can't tell you exactly what. With the relationship of Watson and Holmes and where they'd go, that those two men love and adore each other, that their relationship has always been at the center of the stories, that it's beautiful, that Doyle was careful and clever about what he revealed about that relationship, and any successful adapter has to see through to the truth underneath. Does all of that mean what I want it to mean? I can't really say. I can say that this absolutely does not check out with the Series 4 we got. Beyond that, there are by my count 5 general explanations for what's going on with the queer subtext on BBC Sherlock. Of them, there are only 2 that I take seriously. Again, I'm going to be transparent throughout this retrospective that I don't know anything for sure. I have reasons for thinking and believing what I do, but that doesn't mean I'm right. So you can feel free to take my assessment of these possibilities with a grain of salt. Explanation 1. It was all, from the most obscure symbolism to the most blatant dialogue, unintentional, or a joke at best. This might seem like an odd option to include on the list since I don't know anyone, even detractors of the show, who subscribes to this. Even they acknowledge what they call the queer baiting on the show. But I did believe this for about 4 years, because that's what the writers had said they had done, at least some of the time, and I was taking their word for it, because for a long time I thought I was incapable of accurately assessing what I had seen. Even revisiting the show initially, I was trying desperately to find any other explanation for every choice other than a queer reading, because I thought seeing one made me a crazy person. You might be able to imagine that I didn't make it particularly far with that. But keep in mind that this is sometimes what the writers say they were doing. Again, they contradict themselves. Explanation 2. The obvious stuff, and maybe even some of the symbolism, depending on how uncharitable you're feeling, was all there on purpose, with no intention of following through for the sole purpose of tricking the audience. Whether that's a cynical cash grab, or to get people invested so they would keep watching, or just because they wanted to mess with people. I know a lot of people who were formerly in TJLC went down this route, and I don't blame you for that, but personally, I don't think this is the right answer. Some of that is, like I alluded to before, to me, this seems to be taking the same intensity of feeling towards the writers from before and just flipping it on its head, but I do have genuine reasons for not believing this is what happened. The most convincing reason is the least reassuring. I don't think these particular writers care enough about their fans to compromise the story for the sake of getting people invested. For better or worse, Mark and Steven genuinely do not appear to care much about what anyone else thinks of their stories but them. They just write their stories the way they want to.
We're making the show we want to make. We don't make it a certain way because fans are pressuring us.
One, I think we have to be pure and write the show kind of for ourselves, which is really what we do.
I read a review the other day that said this season was meant to be the one that was for the fans, and now they've really darkened it. And I thought, who said that? Where was that public statement? So it's not, it's, as Steve says, we've got to be, we're doing it for ourselves always. We have an extraordinary, active, vocal fan base. But the people who just tune in every 2 years on January the 1st are people who just go, oh, Sherlock's back on, and they like it or they don't, and that's the truth. So you can't let that into your head, because it'll start to, it starts to actually change the course of what you're trying to do, and we're really just still making it for ourselves.
That leads me to the real reason I've discounted this explanation. In preparation for this retrospective, I watched BBC Dracula, and I realized while doing so that 1, BBC Sherlock was not a fluke. 2, they seem to have really nailed down the sort of story they enjoyed telling and have gotten lucky enough to just be able to do that. Good for them. And most importantly to this discussion, 3, a large part of the story they like to tell involves queer subtext. It's part of what they like, regardless of what they will tell you in interviews. They wouldn't keep playing with it if they didn't have fun doing it. I'll be discussing BBC Dracula in depth in part 6, and hopefully I can demonstrate what I mean there. For now, I don't think the queer subtext in either story is malicious. It's just part of the story they want to tell. Explanation 3. This is going to sound like a retread, but hear me out. The queer subtext and some or all of the symbolism was intentional, with no intention of following through, because raising the question is the point, and that conversation is more interesting to the writers than any one answer. The difference between this and option 2 is the motivation. In this scenario, it's not being done for anyone's benefit but the writers, because it's the story they want to tell. Along with it being an accident or a joke, this is the other explanation that the writers say is what they meant with BBC Sherlock. And this explanation is the first on the list that I do genuinely take seriously. It seems possible to me in retrospect that when the writers talked about loving the desperately unspoken relationship in private life, what they meant was exactly that. They loved the unspoken yearning. That when Steven said you can't ever confirm it one way or another, he meant it. That it's a case of the lady and the tiger, or the spinning top at the end of Inception. That the question is the compelling thing to them. I do have reasons to doubt this too. I'm not 100% sold on it, but I do hold it in about equal regard with another explanation on this list. Explanation 4. The subtext and symbolism was intentional. TJLC got it right, but something happened and the plan changed. I'm aware of 2 sub-variations of this. That the plan was changed by an outside force, be that the Doyle estate or the BBC or something else, or that the writers were upset that people predicted where their story was going and changed the plan out of spite. I've already mentioned that I think these writers prioritize the story they want to tell above all else. Yes, it does sometimes seem like they're trying to outsmart their audience, but I don't think people predicting where their story would go would be enough to get them to change their plans.
But one very respected reviewer actually said they've even put in the popular online theory about the squash ball. It's like, no, that's how he did it, and it was in the end of the Reichenbach fall. I was gobsmacked.
So I'm going to discount the latter. For the former, I will say that for years, this is the explanation I wanted to be true. That I had gotten it right, but it was outside of my hands, and outside of theirs too. And I can't say definitively that this isn't what happened, but again, watching BBC Dracula and the many things it has in common with Sherlock makes me think that both shows are wholly the stories they wanted to tell. If you've seen Dracula, well, after that final moment of the show, it doesn't seem to me that there's anyone out there telling them no. So maybe, but I don't really think so. Explanation 5. The subtext and symbolism was intentional, TJLC got it right, and the story isn't over. And this idea gets the biggest pin of all because it requires much more discussion than the others. But if you've done the math, you already know that this is the other option that I take seriously. I think it's possible that the game is still on. That's why the final video of this retrospective is a continuation of TJLC Explained, apart from it being my one and only chance to make TJLC Explained the way I wish I had looking back on it. But I still remain, rather deliberately sometimes, unconvinced, because I know now what it feels like to be sure about this and then get it wrong. I regret putting myself into that position once. I won't do it again. When I promised you that I'm not going to try to convince you that TJLC is the correct reading, I meant that. I only want to show that TJLC was and is a reasonable reading. It was not absurd to believe in. Not at the time, not even now. But I definitely don't think believing the game is still on is necessary to finding closure. In fact, it kind of complicates things, doesn't it? If I could say with 100% certainty that I knew what happened, and what happened wasn't a plan, that would be much neater. But I can't say that, and I'm not going to lie, even if it would be an easier story. I never said this was an easy story to come to terms with. It's not. But it is a better one than many of us have been telling ourselves, even when it's hard. So what did the writers intend? I don't know. I don't think it's a question of whether or not there's subtext in Sherlock. And I don't even think it's a question that it's there because it's part of the story that they wanted to tell. I just don't know for sure what that story is. But even with that, the idea that BBC Sherlock was made from a genuine place, even if it's a place I don't agree with or understand, does bring me some solace. To summarize this video, TJLC is a reading that tries to make sense of BBC Sherlock using what amounts to fairly basic literary and film theory. Symbols indicated to the audience in dialogue, looking for mirror characters for information about the main ones, and examining the ways the writers might be commenting on their work within the text. The statements made by the writers seem to be deliberately contradictory and confusing, and so it makes sense that two people, or the same person at two different times, can look at these interviews and take away completely different messages. It's very easy to see only what you want to see. That doesn't mean you made up the hints that the writers had a plan. Those were there too. Whether they follow up on those things or not, you weren't crazy to see the symbolism and the hints and wonder if they might lead somewhere. We've started this retrospective with the heavy stuff, the symbolism and literary techniques, and the discussion of authorial intent, because I think those are conversations we needed to have before we could return to the story. Hopefully, if you went into this video regretting your time with TJLC, you regret it a little less now. Now that we've established that framework, we can move on to some lighter subject matter. The next 3 videos are a retrospective look back on the first 10 episodes of BBC Sherlock. I'm going to be pointing out the ways a TJLC reading is supported by the story, and some of the ways the story doesn't make sense without it. I hope to remind you that before you ever looked into the symbolism or an interview, there was something on this show that made you wonder. To paraphrase the great John Watson, the romance was there, we could not alter the facts. We may have suppressed them to ourselves in the years since, but they were always there. If you look back on it and think you hate BBC Sherlock, I hope to show you that it's a better story than you remember, or at least it had the potential to be one. So I'll see you next time for a discussion of A Study in Pink, The Blind Banker, and The Great Game. Thank you for watching.